With those words, the City Council began one of the longest debates in recent history. Even Arthur Snyder, a staunch opponent of rent control, had resigned himself to the reality of post-Proposition 13 life. But the facts of life didn't make anything easier for rent control champion Joel Wax and others who wanted the ordinance expanded.
I think that the single most significant factor that's before us today is that the rent control law in the city of Los Angeles has worked and worked well in the interest of the people of this city. It has stopped the rent gouging.
California that testified for Section 8. I didn't see any of these other people build this kind of the rental industry is not a good business. And so what we have to do, and I understand as well as everybody else, I'm 77 years old, and I understand the senior citizen.
My motion is to amend whichever ordinance we adopt to strike
that the no position went overwhelmingly in every but there are that vacancy decontrol.
If we have a model rent control ordinance already in the city,
Today, the City Council is going to adopt some form of rent control, and for another year in the city of Los Angeles. I told them the other
demonstrations, applause are not allowed during debate. So will you comply with the council rules?
On the maintenance of supply, and that the problems of maintenance of supply.
The capacity crowd was equally divided between tenants and landlords, and speaking on behalf of property owners was Howard Jarvis. But his fiery rhetoric was gone. The temper never flared, and many were surprised to see him leave the podium so soon and so tamely. As debate went into its third hour, some council members took lunch at their places in chambers. It was a compromise they eventually hammered out. 7% annual increases remain, along with exemptions for luxury units and voluntarily vacated apartments. But violations of the ordinance are now criminal, not just civil offenses, and requirements for so-called just cause evictions have been tightened, giving tenants more protection against unethical owners that evict in order to increase rents. As Arthur Snyder said this morning, the only real decision before the council today was what kind of rent control ordinance it would adopt. The hours of debate notwithstanding, there are many now looking to the future, wondering not if, but rather what kind of rent control ordinance will be argued in these chambers next year. For News at 10, Tony Valdez.
Where are you going?
going to Chicago.
Okay, right around the corner. Where are you going, Mom? Where are you going? Vegas?
Where's the little filming?
The transition cars are small.
Turn it on.
Los Angeles Union Station was built by the Union Pacific, Santa Fe, and Southern Pacific Railroads in the late 1930s. During the heyday of rail travel, it was considered one of the finest facilities of its kind. Through the years, the decline of rail travel was mirrored by Union Station, an empty building falling farther into disrepair. In recent years, Union Station has been coming back. Amtrak has been operating more and more passenger trains, 6 a day to San Diego, others to Seattle, Las Vegas, Chicago, and New Orleans. And now that Caltrans has decided to purchase the terminal, Union Station will become the focal point of a total system of transportation which brings trains, buses, the proposed downtown people mover, and the Wilshire Corridor subway all together. To formalize it, Governor Brown, Mayor Bradley, Caltrans Director Gianturco, and others took part in a double signing ceremony.
We believe that public transportation is one of the critical services in this community. and to bring it all together in one regional center is, I think, one of the most progressive steps that this community has ever taken. I'm delighted to be a part of it.
This is such a wise one. And I don't mean that in any derogatory manner, certainly. I know that Mr. Wax is very concerned that someone, and as he expressed himself to me, is in my own
Santa Monica. In some units which are controlled out in Santa Monica recently, you had a 6-unit apartment building. All 6 of the units were absolutely identical, but people were paying different rents in each unit because some had been there longer. One tenant had moved in 1973. I believe they were paying moves out. Right now, if we adopt the majority report,
whether it's gouging a person who's already in an apartment or rent gouging a person who's trying to move into a new apartment, it's still rent gouging. There has to be rent control for all apartments, vacated or not. We cannot provide incentives for landlords to evict. Our office has received hundreds of calls over the last
any form of rent control whatsoever. The idea and the thought that it hasn't hindered new construction in Southern California is an erroneous statement. And I don't know how those figures would come about or what they are all about.
I hope you'll stand corrected, Mr. Councilman.
All right, thank you.
Is that?
Prepare the roll.
Will enter a strange position in the minority of the committee and in presenting the minority report. The minority report does continue a system of rent control. I want it to be plain to everyone here and in the city and everybody that's in the audience that I do not believe that rent control should be continued in the city of Los Angeles. I believe and I suppose enough said on that subject. I've spoken my mind on the subject of rent control and its detrimental and damaging aspects in the city, in the long-term range of the whole entire city economy, and particularly in the field of housing on many occasions. And I don't think there's anybody in the city that thinks that I have a great sympathy for rent control. However, it appears obvious as I, as a member of the council, as a member of the committee, have discussed this matter with the various for a city councilman in which you have a district where you represent a district in which the average rents are $142 a month, to give much support to an ordinance which says, oh, those poor folks that are paying $2,500 a month for their apartments, we really want to give them the protection of the law so that they won't have to pay $3,000 a month for their apartments. If there is a rationale for rent control, it is the protection of those who are unable to protect themselves. And I simply submit that there is no social rationale for rent control for luxury units in the city of Los Angeles. If a person is paying $1,500 a month and his rent is raised to $2,000 a month, well, then he can jolly well go find himself a unit that rents for $1,500 a month somewhere else if he can't afford the $2,000 a month. And I do not feel that it is a social advantage to this city to be providing the protection of government for the rich.
Mr. Snyder, I think Mr. Bernardi reminded me that he just made a presentation of his results. You can remove him from the council chamber.
Right, item B,
we're trying to get through with a very serious matter, and we don't want to be disturbed by applause or demonstrations. Please, would you comply with the council?
Item B, Mr. President, deals with the question of the elimination of vacancy decontrol.
Our studies have showed that rent control in Los Angeles has not had a debt that were plaguing us 2 years ago, and most importantly, it has cooled the real estate speculation which was rampant in multiple residential buildings, and those facts should be put in the statement of findings and be adopted by this council. And I think that the most significant factor that we have today is that we are discussing simply what form of rent stabilization, as opposed to 2 years ago when it was rent control or no rent control. And the fact that even people like Mr. Snyder and others is as staunchly against rent control as they are, have come in today and brought the dialogue to a point where we're discussing the substantive points of the particular ordinances, and it's a far cry from what was discussed 2 years ago. I think that in and of itself is recognition of the fact that we have had an ideal model rent stabilization ordinance. Now, there are differences between the two reports. That means that any apartment...
CD control, and it's really just common sense. What if you were a landlord and you were a little example of the sort of absurd situation you can have if vacancy decontrol disappears? It occurred in New York, and it's been a
decontrolling. That is one of the proposed amendments that we are going to set up a situation in which landlords and tenants are going to be continually going after each other for the next years as long as this vacancy decontrol is in effect. It is providing a very strong financial incentive for landlords to try and harass or otherwise evict tenants out of their properties, out of their apartments. Now, even if you close the loopholes concerning relatives in the just cause evictions, and you tighten up the eviction protections, and you put in the criminal penalties, which we are strongly in favor of, you are telling landlords that your financial incentive is not to go through the legitimate eviction process, but your financial incentive to evict is to go through the harassment process of letting the apartment deteriorate, of phone calls after midnight, which we have reports of tenants, of repeated eviction notices that are never followed through with in court, in which we have cases to report on that, and other methods that will be an incentive to the landlords to go outside the law. I don't think I need to remind you the history of landlord-tenant relationships in this city. After Proposition 10, which was the fraudulent campaign.
All the grim predictions that landlords gave us of what was going to happen if we had rent control proved to be untrue. They did a last-ditch desperate effort to trick people into voting rent control out with the fraudulent Prop 10. But tenants are wise to the fact that, and everybody in the city is wise to the fact that rent control is what the city needs at this time, in the time of a critical housing shortage. And the city council has come to recognize that too, and many landlords have finally come to recognize that as well. The only question now is to have an effective rent control. And this is what the tenants are putting forth, every tenant organization. We're not talking about give us a pro-tenant type amendments as opposed to pro-landlord. We're just talking about amendments to make the rent control effective. Take out the loopholes, in other words. The biggest loophole is vacancy decontrol. You know, the whole purpose of the rent control law was to stop rent gouging. And rent gouging
have taken a little look at what we're trying to do and what you're considering today. And it looks to me like if you pass the majority report, you're going to have to keep a base rent of statistics on 650,000 units. 650,000 units in this city. Every one of them will have to register individually. The city will have to communicate with every tenant to verify the rent rates. And you'll have to update the records every time a vacancy occurred. Now, the cost is estimated, I understand, is in the neighborhood of $1 million. But across the United States, I find that any action that a city takes in rent control with any apartment, the average cost is $10 a unit. I think you have to understand something about the apartment business in the state of California. 185,000 owners in California. There is no other possible answer.
Industry Association is directly opposed to
end up being a situation that will, to the extent possible, benefit everybody involved. And I'm not